The orange sample demonstrates some introductory hand manipulation techniques, including one by one ribbing, twisted stitches and their variations, and two by two cables, with some additional variations that help to offset the cable from the knit ground. There's also a new cast on and bind off in this method. So this cast on you've already worked. It's the comb cast on. It's not suitable for a finished edge, but it does help us get work on the machine rather quickly. So I've selected every alternate needle. I've knit one row in my waste yarn, which is a yarn that's highly contrasting against the main yarn that I'm going to use to knit the sample. And I've hung the comb, making sure I didn't catch that working yarn behind the tines in the comb. And then I'll pull the empty needles forward and knit a second row. I'll work a couple rows, 10 or so, just to establish a ground of waste yarn, because this is going to make it a bit easier for us to have something to hold on to as we reform the stitches in one by one rib. I need a separation row of ravel cord knit between the waste yarn and the main knitting. This is going to be pulled out later so that the waste yarn cleanly separates, but without this, I'd have to cut the knitting out from the bottom of this cast on edge in orange that will work here shortly. So to work the separation row and ravel cord, hold the yarn tail coming from the waste yarn and the bottom of the ravel cord below the machine and knit one loose row across. I didn't adjust the tension dial settings, but I'm just holding the ravel cord above the machine rather loosely and giving it quite a bit of slack so that it feeds in smoothly. So I free passed using the slip function, and now I'm going to cast on over all of the needles that I brought to hold with the crochet chain latch tool cast on, whatever you want to call it. So I'll begin by forming a slip knot in the working end of the orange yarn that's going to be my main yarn, and I'm going to put the tool inside that slip knot and tighten it up just a little bit. I still want it to be able to ride up and down the shank of the tool, so don't over tighten it. Place the tool between the first and second needle on the side opposite the carriage and manually draw through a stitch to form a chain stitch around each needle. Don't work this in the hooks, work it close to the gate pegs like I'm demonstrating here. When you get to the last stitch, simply place the loop that's on the latch tool onto the last needle and draw the working yarn underneath that last needle before you put it into the yarn feeder in the carriage. This first row might be a bit tight. There's this pretty bulky cast on plus a row of ravel cord inside, so never force the carriage, but know that it might be a bit tight. So you can see here a bit that that cast on was worked right on top of the ravel cord. You can still see that pink purl bar of the ravel cord row just above the cast on. I want my ribbed section to be 10 rows tall, so I'm not going to include the cast on row or that first pass in the 10 that I'm going to count, but I will knit 10 rows after that initial pass. To reform stitches when working single bed, like we are in class, you'll need to use the latch tool. I will rarely reform the last column of stitches in the selvage edge. It's just a bit tough. Insert the latch tool into that stitch just above the ravel cord row and drop the stitch from the needle. The end bits are always a little bit more difficult to work, but you can get it. You might have to prod and poke to get the stitches to drop. But then I'm going to use the latch tool to reform all of those bars or floats that have been formed because I've dropped the stitch. I'm keeping the latch tool pretty parallel with the floor and just moving it in and out and then obviously up as I work up the rows that I've knit. So again, you can see this knit stitch on the purl facing side of the work. The needle selection for 1x1 rib is just reforming every other column of stitches, again with the exception of the selvage edge. So here I'll insert the tool into the stitch just above the purl bump from the ravel cord, drop the stitch from the needle, and then if you pull or push the latch tool down, and sometimes depending on the yarn, poke it with your finger, it will help unravel. So as I work this, I'm pushing the stitch on the latch tool behind the latch of the latch tool, and then grabbing the float above it in the hook and drawing the float through that previous stitch. This can be a lengthy process, especially if you're knitting a wide piece, but in time you'll get a bit faster. Because I'm working over an even number, I'm going to have 2 stitches on the right hand side, or the opposite side that I started from, that will have 2 adjacent purl facing rows. It's no problem. After I finish the rib, I'll knit 10 or so rows just to separate it from the next sample. After the work is off the machine, we'll take the ravel cord out. But you can see how these kind of component pieces are all working together. The next sample we'll work are twisted stitches, and then a few variations based on this same principal method. So to work these, you'll need a double prong transfer tool to twist the stitches. So begin by picking up 2 stitches on the tool and rotating the tool 1 full rotation in either direction, and then redeposit the stitches back onto those needles. Because we've twisted the stitches, the stitch or the loop has become a bit smaller, so sometimes it can be challenging, as you see me struggling here, to get these back on to those needles. So you can see those 2 stitches have been twisted together. I'm going to skip 4 or so stitches and then repeat that process. Because those stitches are a little bit tight, I'm going to pull those needles out to hold to help the carriage more easily knit them back. We're doing half of the work for the carriage already. This will make it a bit easier to pass the carriage. Knit a few rows just to separate these, and you can see that kind of twist from the purl side. In this next example, I'm going to form the twist just as I had in the previous sample, but this time I'm going to offset the twist by forming an eyelet on either side. So I'll transfer the left and right stitch out 1 from the twist itself, but leave those needles in working position so that they'll pick up a float and form an eyelet when I knit the next 2 rows at least. In the next example, I'm going to work twisted stitches within elongated stitch rows. So because I've got more play, because the stitch length is enormous, I can twist the stitches more than once. I'll form one row of long stitch, which by now we're all accustomed to, and then begin to twist those long stitches together. In the sample, the first row are twisted only once, and then in the second row they're twisted twice. I'm gonna mix those two up in this sample, but follow the sample posted on the wall. The methodology that I'm demonstrating here is exactly the same. You're just gonna do a whole row of single twist, and then knit a few rows to separate it, run another long row of stitches, and then twist those groups of stitches twice. You can even try 3 times. So here we can see the density of the twists are a little bit different because one's been twisted once and the other twice. Again, work one row of single twists and then another row of double or triple twists. The next sample that will work is a cable, which is built on sort of the same foundation as the twisted stitch. Instead of twisting the tool, I'll need 2 tools to pick up sets of stitches that I'll then simply swap position on the needle bed. So using 2 separate tools, pick up 4 stitches, 2 adjacent groups, and move both tools 2 spaces to the left. So I'm depositing the stitches that were on the right onto the 2 left stitches, and then I'm just filling in the 2 remaining empty stitches with the stitches that are on the tool on the left side. So you can see how they've crossed a bit. There is some tension that's put on the needles because we're stretching these stitches across. So if I pull them to hold, you can see that they touched a bit, the end of the needles. Pull them back to forward working position to spread them out a bit. The last thing you want are needles hooking onto one another and jamming up the carriage. So from the knit side, you can see how those cables have crossed one another. You can vary the number of rows you knit in between each cable cross. So the first one on the bottom has 4, the second one right above it has 6 rows between each twist. You can offset cables from the knit ground and make them pop out or stand out a little bit more prominently using a couple different methods. This first one employs making runs on either side of the cable twist. So before I twist a cable, I'm going to set up the needle bed a bit and isolate those 4 needles that I'm going to work the cable on by putting a run on either side. After I've knit a couple rows, you can see the run forming and twist the cable as you did in the first example. It's probably going to be a little bit easier this time to twist the cable because you've got some slack built in by those floats that are formed from the run. It's still advised that you pull the needles out to hold, and then if the hooks are touching, draw them back to forward work. But it should be a bit easier, I think, to cross the cables this time. In this last example, we will offset the stitches on either side of the cable with the reformed row of purl facing stitches on the knit side. I'm going to work the cable and everything exactly the same, but before I start the twist, I'm going to reform a few stitches. So I'm counting down 4 loops, running the stitch, and then using the latch tool to relatch that dropped column of stitches in the same row that contained the run from the previous sample. So after I've done my reformed, tiny bit of the column, I'll then cross the cable in the same way that I did previously and work any number of rows. 4 or 6 seem to be the ones that appear most frequently. Again, get in the habit of helping your machine and your carriage out by pulling the stitches to hold, the needles to hold rather, and then back to forward work just to make it a bit easier on the carriage. I've knit 4 rows, and now I need to reform those stitches again. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, insert the latch tool, drop the stitch, and reform those ladders in the order that they appear. You could, in theory, work several rows of cables before you reform, but it's far more manageable to do this in smaller groups. It would be a nightmare if you had a 100-row sweater front that was fully cabled and that you had to reform all 100 rows on either side of the cable from the cast on up. So work in small groups. It'll save you some trouble and headache, I think, in the long run. What's important, though, is that you remember how many rows you've knit so that when you count the stitches down to put the tool in, you're not going to mess up the stitch pattern by having a random knit stitch within the reformed purl column from the knit facing side of the work. You can, with time, spot this easily, but as a beginner, count. It's the only insurance you've got. So from the knit side, you can see these wells that form on either side. You could reform all of those stitches in between the cables and make the cable on an entire purl ground if you wanted, which looks really nice as well. A lot of work, though, on single bed. So the last bit here is the bind off. So I'm going to use this single prong transfer tool and work the gate peg bind off with the transfer tool. It's a little fiddly. It takes a minute to get used to it, but it's not so bad. We want to bind around the gate pegs in a lot of instances simply because it helps to tension the bind off. If we bind off and not use the gate pegs, the bind off is most likely to draw in a bit, and we don't want that. So to work this, I'm going to pick up a stitch and transfer its neighbor, but I'm going to make sure that the stitch slips behind the gate peg. So it kind of traps it or wraps the stitch around the gate peg before I manually knit 1 stitch back. And I'll simply repeat this across all the stitches in work. When I get to the other side, the last step is to draw that working yarn all the way through the last stitch, cut the yarn, and then pull that loop all the way through, locking off this chain stitch, or this bind off rather. Off the machine, you can pull the ravel cord or the separation row out from between the knitting and the waste yarn. Once the ravel cord's been pulled out, the waste yarn will simply fall away. And because we worked a closed edge cast on above the separation row, we'll have a closed, clean, finished edge when we're done.